Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning to the witnesses. My home state of California has one of the longest coastlines, stretching 840 miles from the Oregon border to Mexico. And of the nearly 40 million people who live in California, 26.3 million of them live in what are considered coastal communities. And according to NOAA, coastal California employs more than 12 million people annually, which translates into $2 trillion in GDP. Those are big numbers. But I share that because all of that is at risk with rising sea levels. And it's not just the economic impact that we must grapple with. A recent study by UC Berkeley and UCLA mapped the more than 400 facilities with hazardous materials that will experience flooding events by the end of the century, including power plants, refineries, industrial facilities, and hazardous waste sites, many of which are located not just in coastal regions, but specifically in disadvantaged communities in the coastal regions. A 3-foot sea level rise will flood 15 wastewater treatment plants in California. Facilities in the San Francisco Bay region are particularly vulnerable, with rising groundwater levels magnifying flood risk. With all that being said, the question is for Mr. Eby. What does your modeling demonstrate about the particular risk for low-income or disadvantaged communities located near aging facilities and infrastructure?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. And as you noted, California is particularly at risk with over 1 million properties that have that similar 1% risk that I was just talking about, growing another 5.5% over the next 30 years. And unfortunately, with that comes the assessments of those that are at risk. So to your question of are we seeing a higher instance of vulnerabilities around the LMI population, the answer is yes. One of our partners, Redfin, a real estate company, used our data in partnership to look at this exact question and found that there's $107 billion in home value at risk of flooding in formerly red-line districts compared to $85 billion in home value at risk from those that were deemed kind of more desirable for lending. And what you're able to see when you look at economic impact per square foot or value of the home, when you see lower value homes and the cost of flooding that goes against them, you see a higher percentage of the home value that is at risk than the more affluent areas across the country. So we see this time and time again by looking at our data that the LMI population is much more at risk and much more exposed and much less likely to be insured, unfortunately, from these events as well.
Thank you. Would welcome your input and feedback as it pertains to, as a result, federal investments in some of these areas to address not just issues of physical impact of sea level rise, but the equity lens that should accompany it. We've also had our fair share of natural disasters in California in recent years. The recent California flooding and severe weather led to anywhere between $5 and $7 billion in total U.S. economic losses, according to new estimates from Moody's. We face a special kind of weather whiplash in California where we cycle back and forth from the worst mega drought in 1,200 years, followed by storm events and extreme flood impacts. Y'all heard about the blizzard warnings in Southern California this last weekend. Under scenarios of 3 feet to 6 feet of sea level rise, up to 2/3 of Southern California beaches may become completely eroded also by the end of the century. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers plays a particularly important role in protecting communities from extreme floods and rising sea levels, but also in beach nourishment projects that are ongoing and require sustained federal investments. Back to you, Mr. Eby. Can you speak to the way your climate modeling looks at risks collectively across fire, heat, flooding, and wind, given that many parts of California experience all of the above?
Yeah. Again, thank you for the question. And with our models, we've created individual versions, high-resolution models to be able to look at these exact questions. So what is the exposure to extreme heat? What is the exposure to hurricane winds? What is the exposure to wildfires and flooding? And in California, specifically, each one of those is represented across the state as current and increasing risk from climate change. We haven't combined these into one overall score or risk or quantification for the state, but I can tell you that individually each one poses a risk overall. Similarly with flooding, especially with things like atmospheric rivers and the severe precipitation that we've seen this year that impacts all of these homes that are outside the FEMA flood zone and the FEMA special flood hazard area. These are just some of the things that we're seeing today that we know are going to be exacerbated in the future from all of these different perils.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your expertise and for participation this morning. Look forward to following up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.